Edwards County, Kansas, June 1879. While his neighbors erected timber frame barns in 2 to 3 weeks using scarce railroad lumber shipped at $45 per thousand board feet, Lars Eriksen was entering his ninth week of construction with no roof frame visible. The 41-year-old Norwegian immigrant continued cutting thick sod bricks from virgin Prairie long after sensible men had moved on to installing doors and whitewashing interiors. His neighbors called it impractical. They called him a fool. He was building a barn entirely from earth, walls 3 feet thick at the base, and tapering to 2 feet at the roofline. A massive structure that would consume 4,800 individual sod bricks, weighing 40 to 50 pounds each. The total weight of his building material approached 240,000 pounds of prairie earth. John Hartford shook his head, saying that barn used more ground than his entire wheat field. Local master carpenter Wilhelm Schmidt, who had built 15 timber barns across Kansas using proven Iowa and Illinois designs, declared proper ventilation impossible with earth walls. Township Supervisor Charles Whitmore predicted structural collapse under Kansas wind loads before harvest season arrived. Hartford's own barn, completed in exactly 19 days, following Connecticut construction methods adapted for prairie conditions, stood as testament to efficient frontier building. The timber frame had cost $180 in materials purchased from the railroad depot in Kinsley, but the investment provided a proper agricultural storage facility with adequate ventilation for grain curing and equipment protection. His 24 by 28-foot structure featured board and batten siding, a shingled roof, and large doors that allowed wagon access for harvest operations. The interior stayed reasonably cool through careful positioning of ventilation gaps and strategic window placement. Schmidt brought professional authority to the growing skepticism about Lars's unconventional approach. The German immigrant had arrived in Kansas 23 years earlier, carrying old-world carpentry training that he had successfully adapted to frontier conditions. His barns featured precise timber joinery, calculated load distributions, and ventilation systems designed to prevent the spontaneous combustion that could occur when damp hay generated heat through decomposition. Schmidt's standard barn design had served dozens of families well, protecting grain stores and equipment through Kansas's unpredictable weather extremes. Sods for desperate house building when you can't afford lumber, Hartford told his wife Elizabeth one evening, watching Lars methodically lay another course of earth bricks. A barn needs proper airflow to prevent grain rot and mold. That Norwegian's wasting good farmland cutting sod when he should be planting wheat. The criticism carried weight in a community where proper agricultural infrastructure meant the difference between successful harvests and economic failure. Schmidt's professional assessment highlighted practical concerns that every farmer understood. Moisture retention in earth walls would create ideal conditions for grain spoilage. The massive weight of sod construction risked structural failure during Kansas windstorms that regularly damaged even well-built timber structures. Most critically, the lack of adequate ventilation created fire hazards from hay that could spontaneously ignite when stored in poorly ventilated conditions. Lars's building specifications became community conversation throughout June and July. His barn platform measured 24 feet deep by 32 feet wide, requiring sod bricks cut to precise dimensions of 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 4 inches thick. Unlike conventional timber construction that could be erected quickly using standardized lumber dimensions, Lars was cutting each brick individually from prairie sod, ensuring root systems remained intact to bind the structure together. He had begun construction on May 15th, digging a foundation 2 feet deep and filling it with gravel for drainage, before laying the first course of sod bricks. Each course was offset like masonry, with roots still living to create what Lars called a breathing wall. The massive earth walls would consume 1/4 of his total floor area compared to Hartford's efficient timber frame that maximized interior storage space. Where Schmidt's professional designs required approximately 2,400 board feet of lumber and could be completed in 3 weeks with two helpers, Lars's project demanded 14 weeks of solitary labor cutting and placing 4,800 individual bricks, weighing a combined 121 tons. When questioned about his methods, Lars offered only brief explanations that revealed knowledge sources unfamiliar to most Kansas settlers. "Earth doesn't burn," he told Schmidt during one of their conversations. "Wood does. I've seen what prairie fire does to timber, seen what it doesn't do to earth." The comment seemed reasonable in theory, but the practical reality of sacrificing efficiency and following unproven construction methods struck most settlers as dangerous experimentation they could not afford. Schmidt pointed out that even stone buildings required proper fire protection, and that radiant heat alone could ignite stored grain regardless of wall material. By late July, Lars had completed his walls and begun installing the minimal timber frame required for roof support. The only wood in his entire structure consisted of support beams spanning the interior space, boards for doors and window shutters, and rafters to carry the final component that mystified his neighbors most. Lars was planning to cover his roof with an additional 8 inches of sod, creating what appeared to be a small hill, rising from the prairie rather than a conventional barn structure. Summer 1879 brought unusual weather patterns that settlers noted with growing unease. Springs throughout Edwards County were running, lower than normal for late July. Prairie grass had cured earlier than usual, turning golden brown by mid-month instead of late August. Wells showed water levels dropping 3 to 4 feet below their typical summer depths. The Kansas Pacific Railroad issued notices requiring enhanced spark arresters on locomotives passing through the dried grasslands. No one spoke the words, "fire season" yet, but the possibility hung unspoken in every conversation about the extraordinary drought gripping the Great Plains. Hartford mentioned casually that his 60-foot firebreak might need expansion if conditions didn't improve. Schmidt checked his water barrels daily and organized volunteer fire brigade assignments among neighboring farms. Lars continued his methodical construction, placing the final sod bricks on his roof as August approached. His massive earth structure stood dark and solid against the prairie horizon, an oddity that neighbors observed with mixture of curiosity and concern. Come September, Hartford predicted to anyone within earshot, "We'll see whether that dirt pile protects anything or just makes the biggest obstacle to defending his property when real fire danger arrives." By August 12th, Lars had completed his sod barn, and the finished structure demonstrated just how radical his departure from conventional construction had become. The walls measured exactly 36 inches thick at the foundation, tapering to 24 inches at the roofline, where they met the timber frame supporting 8 inches of sod roofing. The total weight of 242,000 pounds created what appeared to be a small earthen fortress rising from the Kansas prairie, with 4 small windows fitted with wooden shutters positioned strategically for ventilation without compromising structural integrity. The interior featured a packed earth floor, minimal wooden support posts, and whitewashed walls that reflected available light through the limited openings. On August 15th, Lars began storing his winter wheat harvest inside the completed barn. 340 bushels of grain, representing 6 months of labor and his family's economic survival for the coming year, disappeared into the cool darkness of the earth structure. Hartford predicted moisture damage within 2 weeks. Schmidt warned that inadequate ventilation would create conditions for weevil infestation and grain spoilage. Whitmore calculated that Lars had spent only $12 on timber for the roof frame compared to the $180 Hartford had invested, but questioned whether 14 weeks of labor represented false economy when conventional construction required only 3 weeks. The first practical test came during the 3rd week of August, when temperatures climbed to 98 degrees Fahrenheit, typical for Kansas summer heat that turned timber barns into ovens, requiring constant door ventilation. Lars maintained a daily temperature log, a practice he had learned from educated Norwegian immigrants who documented agricultural conditions for optimizing crop yields. His measurements revealed interior barn temperatures of 67 degrees, a full 31-degree differential from exterior conditions. Humidity levels inside remained stable at 45 to 50%, ideal for grain storage and prevention of mold growth. Hartford acknowledged the temperature differential as remarkable but untested long-term. His own timber barn, despite careful window positioning and ventilation gap planning, registered interior temperatures of 85 degrees during afternoon heat. He was forced to leave large doors open for airflow, creating security concerns and exposing stored equipment to weather and potential theft. Schmidt questioned whether Lars's thick walls could withstand winter freeze-thaw cycles that caused earth structures to crack and deteriorate. The German carpenter had seen poorly constructed sod houses collapse after severe winters, and he worried that barn-scale earth construction would prove even more vulnerable to structural failure. When Hartford invited neighbors to inspect grain storage quality in mid-August, the comparison became unavoidable. Wheat stored in Lars's sod barn showed no moisture damage, no musty odor, common in poorly ventilated wooden structures, and no signs of the weevil activity already appearing in Hartford's timber barn, despite his professional construction methods. The stable temperature and humidity levels created ideal preservation conditions that conventional ventilation strategies struggled to match. Lars shared information about his knowledge sources during these inspections, revealing influences unfamiliar to most Kansas farmers. He described Ukrainian settlers in Minnesota who used zemlyanka construction, earth-sheltered buildings for root cellars, and livestock shelters that maintained stable temperatures year-round. He mentioned Norwegian building traditions from Telemark region, where his father had farmed for 30 years, hillside structures using earth and stone that had withstood centuries of harsh weather. Most significantly, he explained thermal mass principles in plain language that his neighbors could understand. 3-foot earth walls provided insulation equivalent to 18 inches of modern materials. The massive weight absorbed heat during the day and released it gradually at night, moderating temperature extremes that plagued timber construction. Root systems in the living sod bricks created a matrix that strengthened over time rather than deteriorating, and moisture regulation occurred naturally through breathable earth walls that prevented the condensation problems affecting sealed wooden structures. Schmidt asked detailed questions about mortar composition and structural load calculations, his professional curiosity overcoming initial skepticism. Hartford admitted privately that his grain showed early quality degradation while Lars's wheat remained in pristine condition. Whitmore noted the dramatic cost savings, but worried about fire performance, pointing out that September typically brought Kansas's highest fire danger as drought-cured prairie grass became explosive fuel waiting for ignition sources. As August ended and September approached, drought conditions intensified throughout Edwards County. 43 consecutive days had passed without measurable precipitation since August 3rd. Native prairie grass had cured to tinder-dry fuel loads estimated at 4,200 pounds per acre. Sustained southwest winds of 15 to 20 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 35, created ideal fire weather conditions. Daytime relative humidity dropped to 12%, and daily high temperatures remained locked between 92 and 98 degrees. The drought had become the most severe in local memory, and experienced settlers recognized the approaching danger even if they didn't speak it aloud. Hartford commented during a late August visit to Lars's property that the real test would come if prairie fire threatened. "Let's see how your earth pile handles real flames," he said, examining the sod walls with professional skepticism. "Wood might burn, but it burns clean and predictable. You can fight wood fire with water and fire breaks. Earth just sits there. Radiant heat alone could ignite everything inside, regardless of what your walls are made from." Lars placed his hand on the cool sod wall, feeling the living roots still binding the bricks together 3 months after construction. Said nothing. Went back to his farming while neighbors prepared for fire season that everyone now knew was coming. September brought fire reports that turned drought anxiety into active fear throughout western Kansas. On September 4th, a small fire near Dodge City burned 200 acres before volunteers contained it. 4 days later, a railroad spark ignited grass near Larned, destroying 3 haystacks worth $120. September 11th brought the most serious warning when lightning struck Prairie northwest of Edwards County, burning 400 acres and coming within 5 miles of settled farms before shifting winds pushed it away from homesteads. The Edwards County leader began printing fire safety warnings in every edition, and township meetings focused exclusively on preparation and defense strategies. John Hartford plowed a 40-foot fire break around his entire property perimeter, double the standard width recommended by agricultural extension guidance. He positioned water barrels at strategic locations, filled them daily from his well, and kept wet burlap sacks ready for beating out spot fires. His family conducted practice drills for rapid barn defense, timing how quickly they could form a bucket brigade from well to building. Wilhelm Schmidt organized a volunteer fire brigade among 8 neighboring farms, positioning his water wagon for rapid deployment and clearing all grass within 100 feet of his structures. Charles Whitmore established a township fire watch system with designated observers scanning horizons for smoke, planned evacuation routes to Kinsley, and identified every water source that could supply emergency firefighting operations. Lars plowed a standard 20-foot fire break, half the width Hartford considered minimum for adequate protection. He positioned no water barrels near his barn. He cleared no vegetation beyond his fire break perimeter, while neighbors frantically prepared defenses against fire danger that felt increasingly inevitable. Lars continued normal farming activities as if September 1879 was ordinary harvest season rather than a drought emergency. The criticism became sharp and personal. Hartford told Lars directly that the sod barn wouldn't matter if fire jumped the inadequate fire break and ignited the roof timber through radiant heat or embercast. "You're gambling your entire harvest on untested theory," Hartford said, calculating that Lars's 340 bushels represented $680 in grain value, most of a year's income for a prairie farmer. Schmidt pointed out that even stone buildings in Germany required fire protection, and that radiant heat could ignite stored grain inside structures regardless of wall material. "Your earth walls won't stop heat from cooking everything inside like an oven," Schmidt warned, explaining how European barn fires often destroyed contents while leaving stone walls standing. Whitmore viewed Lars's minimal preparation as a township liability. On September 13th, he called a community meeting at the Township Hall and formally requested that Lars implement additional fire safety measures. "Expand your fire break to 60 feet minimum," Whitmore demanded. "Clear all combustibles within 150 feet of your barn. Position water supplies for emergency response. Consider moving your stored grain to a safer location until fire season passes." Whitmore explained that if Lars's property caught fire, sparks and embers could spread to neighboring farms, endangering families who had taken proper precautions. Lars rarely spoke at length in community gatherings, but this time he stood and addressed the assembled farmers directly. "I've seen wildfires in Norway take timber churches that stood 400 years, he said quietly. "Never saw one harm a stone foundation or earthen wall. Fire needs fuel and air. My barn gives it neither. The wheat stays where it is." The response satisfied no one. Hartford argued that prairie fires behaved differently than Norwegian forest fires, that grass fires generated less total heat, but spread faster and created dangerous embercast that could ignite structures far ahead of the main flame front. Schmidt explained that prairie fires could travel 10 to 15 miles per hour in moderate wind, reaching flame heights of 8 to 12 feet in dense grass fuel. Radiant heat from those flames could ignite wooden structures 50 feet away without direct contact, and ember casts could carry burning material a quarter-mile ahead of the fire line. Hartford added that wooden structures typically ignited from ember accumulation in eaves and under roof edges rather than direct flame contact, making Lars's sod roof vulnerable at the wooden support structure underneath. Lars listened without argument, but made no changes to his preparation. Whitmore documented the meeting officially, noting that the township had advised Lars Eriksen of inadequate fire safety measures, and that any resulting property damage would be his own responsibility. September 14th brought weather conditions that transformed anxiety into dread. Barometric pressure dropped sharply through the afternoon. Wind shifted to south-southwest, the worst possible direction for Edwards County because it would drive any southern fire directly through the settled township area. Temperature climbed to 96 degrees by 3 o'clock, despite the approaching evening. Humidity fell to 9%, well into critical fire weather territory, where any ignition source could generate explosive fire behavior. By sunset, distant smoke was visible on the southern horizon. A faint haze that experienced prairie dwellers recognized immediately as wildfire, dozens of miles away. That evening, Lars walked his property in failing light. He placed his hand on the cool sod wall of his barn, feeling the temperature differential between the sun-baked exterior surface and the earth's stored coolness just inches deeper. He looked south where an orange glow pulsed faintly against the darkening sky. Then, he went inside his house for supper. He did not position water barrels. He did not wet down his fire break. He did not prepare emergency equipment. Hartford watched from his own property with disbelief. Schmidt told his wife that Lars was either the bravest man in Kansas or the most foolish, and that by tomorrow they would know which. Whitmore sent his family to stay with relatives in Kinsley, expecting the worst, and hoping the township's preparation would be enough to save most structures when the fire arrived. The orange glow on the southern horizon grew brighter through the night. September 16th, 4:47 in the morning. Charles Whitmore's alarm bell shattered the pre-dawn darkness across Edwards County. The fire had been spotted 12 miles south at first light, advancing northward on sustained winds of 25 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 40. Early reports from riders coming hard from Kinsley described a flame front 4 miles wide that had already consumed 3 homesteads south of town. The fire was traveling approximately 12 miles per hour, faster than a man could run, faster than most families could evacuate with their possessions loaded in wagons. By 6 o'clock, Hartford had his family loaded into their wagon, heading for Kinsley with essential belongings and family records. He remained behind with 2 hired men to defend his property, organizing a continuous water application system to keep his barns, exterior wet, and the 60-foot fire break soaked. Schmidt's volunteer fire brigade of 8 men took positions around his property with wet burlap sacks, beating tools, and his water wagon filled to capacity. Every combustible material within 150 feet had been removed days earlier. His family sheltered in a neighbor's dugout, a sod house built partially underground that offered better protection than conventional structures. At Lars's property, the family remained in their sod house, built using the same earth construction principles as the barn. No fire brigade assembled, no water wagons stood ready. Lars moved his livestock to the plowed fire break area, the only visible concession he made to the approaching disaster. He stood on a slight rise, watching the smoke column grow darker against the southern sky. At 11:15, smoke became visible from ground level, the sky darkening to twilight dimness, though noon approached. Ash began falling like snow across the prairie, small black flakes drifting on superheated air that pushed temperatures to 110 degrees. By 11:22, the fire's roar became audible from 2 miles away, a sound witnesses compared to a freight train running at full speed. At 11:28, the leading edge of superheated air reached the properties, wilting unprotected vegetation and forcing men to shield their faces. At 11:30, the wall of flame crested the southern ridgeline, 10 feet high and stretching beyond sight in both directions. The fire hit Hartford's property at 11:33. It reached his 40-foot fire break and momentarily slowed, but wind-driven embers sailed across the gap and ignited grass inside the perimeter. Radiant heat from the approaching flame front began drying the water Hartford and his men had applied to the barn's south wall. They desperately threw more water, but the volume was insufficient against heat that could be felt 30 feet away. At 11:39, the barn's south-facing wall ignited despite their efforts. The timber frame caught quickly, and within 3 minutes, interior combustion began consuming stored grain and equipment. By 11:47, Hartford abandoned the defense and retreated to his plowed safety zone. His barn became a tower of flame. 340 bushels of wheat worth $680 burned, along with equipment and the barn structure itself, total losses exceeding $1,200. Schmidt's fire brigade met the flame front at 11:52 with coordinated water application and organized defensive positions. For 6 minutes, their preparations seemed adequate. The north side held against the flames. Then wind gusts shifted embers onto the west flank, overwhelming the defenders before they could reposition. Burning debris accumulated in the barn's eaves, where Schmidt's careful carpentry had created small gaps for ventilation. At 12:03, the roof ignited. The water supply, calculated for sustained defense against ground fire, proved insufficient for fighting structure fire. Schmidt ordered evacuation at 12:08. 280 bushels of wheat and farming equipment burned in a structure that collapsed into ash within 20 minutes. Total losses approached $520. At 12:15, the fire reached Lars's property from the south-southwest. He stood near his sod barn, making no defensive movements while neighbors watched from safe distances, expecting complete destruction. The flame front hit his 20-foot fire break and kept coming, pushed by 25-mile-per-hour winds that carried burning embers across any gap. For 8 minutes, fire surrounded the property in continuous flame. Grass burned intensely up to the fire break edge. Embers ignited patches of grass within the break. Flames made direct contact with the barn's south wall. For approximately 3 minutes, a solid curtain of fire pressed against 240,000 pounds of prairie earth. The sod wall's surface blackened from direct flame contact. The roof surface darkened from radiant heat that would have ignited any wooden structure within 50 feet. Inside, Lars later reported, the temperature rose from 67 degrees to 82 degrees, a 15-degree increase, while exterior temperatures exceeded 900 degrees at the wall surface. No smoke emerged from the interior. No flames penetrated the 3-foot walls. No structural damage appeared. At 12:23, the main flame front passed north beyond Lars's property, leaving spot fires burning in surrounding grass, but moving on toward other townships. The sod barn stood intact against a landscape transformed to smoking black earth. 340 bushels of wheat remained safe inside walls that had absorbed heat without burning, that had protected contents without water defense, that had done exactly what Lars said Earth would do. By 2 o'clock, the fire had been contained 8 miles north of the township. Total Edwards County losses reached 23 structures destroyed, 4 injuries, 0 deaths. Hartford and Schmidt returned to properties still smoking, staring at stone foundations and metal fragments that marked where their barns had stood. Lars opened his barn door, walked inside to check his grain, found it cool and undamaged. When he emerged, Hartford and Schmidt stood near the blackened south wall, their hands pressed against earth that had been hot enough to char its surface but cool enough, 3 feet deep, to keep a family's survival safe inside. September 17th, dawn. Lars conducted a methodical inspection of his barn, documenting fire effects with the same careful attention he had given to construction. The exterior walls showed surface carbonization 1 to 2 inches deep, where flames had made direct contact, but structural integrity remained unchanged. The sod roof's surface layer had blackened, yet moisture in the deeper layers had prevented the timber frame underneath from igniting. Interior temperature had returned to 69 degrees overnight, and stored wheat showed no smoke damage, no heat degradation, no fire-related loss of any kind. All 340 bushels remained in perfect condition, worth $680 that Hartford and Schmidt no longer possessed. By mid-morning, 12 township families had assembled at Lars's property without formal invitation. They came to see what their preparation and professional expertise had failed to achieve. The sod walls showed scorch marks, but no structural damage. Root systems in the sod bricks were still living despite direct flame exposure. The 3-foot wall thickness had protected the interior during 11 minutes of fire contact that had destroyed wooden barns with 60-foot fire breaks and professional fire brigades defending them. Earth's thermal mass had absorbed radiant heat that would have ignited timber at 50 feet distance. Moisture content in the deep sod layers had created an effective fire barrier that no amount of water application to wooden surfaces could match. John Hartford asked the question everyone had come to hear answered. How did you know? What made you certain enough to risk everything? Lars described witnessing an 1868 wildfire in Minnesota where a Ukrainian settler's Zemlyanka had survived 15 minutes of direct flame exposure, while wooden barns within 50 feet burned completely. He mentioned his father's teaching from Norway about medieval earthen fortifications that had resisted siege fires for weeks, and living sod roofs that had protected Norwegian buildings against ember cast for centuries. He explained simply that he had seen earth withstand what wood could not, and he had trusted what he had seen. Wilhelm Schmidt, the master carpenter whose professional reputation had been built on 15 years of timber construction, conducted an impromptu technical analysis that afternoon. He calculated heat penetration through Lars's 36-inch south wall during peak fire exposure. The exterior surface had reached approximately 900 degrees Fahrenheit during direct flame contact. The interior surface had measured 82 degrees, only 15 degrees above normal. Earth's non-combustible properties meant it provided no fuel for fire, regardless of temperature. The thick walls prevented heat transfer through sheer mass and moisture content. No air cavities existed for fire penetration, unlike wood frame construction, where gaps and voids allowed flame to spread through structures. Schmidt compared wood's ignition temperature of 500 to 600 degrees against Earth's complete non-combustibility, and admitted that a 3-foot earth wall provided superior fire protection to any thickness of timber that could be practically constructed. Charles Whitmore documented the financial comparison with arithmetic that made earth construction's advantage undeniable. Hartford had lost $1,200 in property and grain, facing $380 to $420 in rebuilding costs. Schmidt's losses totaled $1,080, with similar reconstruction expenses ahead. Lars's damage amounted to $8 in labor for surface resodding of scorched areas. His initial construction investment of $12 in timber for the roof frame and 14 weeks of labor had preserved $680 in grain that his neighbors had lost, while his structure stood ready for immediate continued use. The community meeting on September 22nd brought 18 families requesting detailed construction consultations. Schmidt abandoned his timber barn reconstruction plans entirely. Hartford began planning a sod barn replacement, acknowledging that his Connecticut construction methods had failed against Kansas fire conditions. Whitmore proposed township workshops on earth construction techniques, recognizing that conventional wisdom had proven inadequate for Prairie survival. What had been fool's construction 6 weeks earlier became essential survival knowledge. Professional carpenter Schmidt asked Norwegian immigrant farmer Lars for technical guidance. The same critics who had mocked his methods now took careful notes during his explanations about site selection, sod brick cutting, foundation preparation, and wall construction techniques. Through late September, Lars conducted 3 workshop sessions, teaching neighbors to identify suitable sod cutting locations where prairie grass root density provided adequate structural binding. He explained proper brick dimensions for load-bearing walls, demonstrated root orientation for creating a living matrix, and showed how minimal mortar was needed because roots bound the bricks together naturally. He taught wall tapering calculations for proper load distribution and roof integration methods that protected timber frames with 8-inch sod layers, providing fire resistance that wooden shingles could never achieve. By October 3rd, Hartford had begun his sod barn foundation. Schmidt started cutting bricks for his reconstruction on October 8th, applying German masonry precision to earth construction methods. 3 additional families commenced building by mid-October. 2 new settlers arriving in the township specifically requested sod barn consultations before beginning any construction. Schmidt's professional transformation became the most visible evidence of the paradigm shift. A master carpenter trained in European timber frame methods for 15 years abandoned those principles completely after watching them fail against prairie fire. He began incorporating earth construction into his professional repertoire, telling anyone who asked that he had built what he was taught rather than what worked, and that Lars had understood the difference. By November 30th, Township sod brick demand had increased 400% compared to August. Not a single new timber barn construction had begun, the first time since the township's 1876 founding that wood had been entirely abandoned for agricultural building. Lars committed 40 hours weekly to consultations instead of farming, teaching methods that would save his neighbors from repeating Hartford and Schmidt's losses. Hartford and Schmidt stood at their respective reconstruction sites in late October, cutting sod bricks side by side. Hartford said quietly that it had taken losing everything to learn what Lars knew all along. Schmidt responded that Lars hadn't just known it, he had trusted it enough to risk everything. Both men paused and looked toward Lars's barn, still standing dark against the horizon, the only agricultural structure visible for miles that hadn't required reconstruction after the fire proved which construction methods belonged on the Kansas prairie and which did not. By November 30th, 11 sod barns were under construction in Edwards County. Spring 1880 brought 23 completed earth construction agricultural buildings across the township. Summer added 8 more starts, including the township's first sod granary designed for community grain storage. Within 12 months of the fire, 31 of the 34 farms in Edwards County had adopted earth construction, a complete reversal of building practices that had dominated prairie settlement for 2 decades. Hartford completed his sod barn in February 1880, building larger than his destroyed timber structure at 28 by 36 feet, with walls 30 inches thick at the base, tapering to 20 inches at the roofline. Construction required 11 weeks and cost $15 for timber roof framing, less than 10% of his previous barn's material cost. Storage capacity reached 420 bushels, 80 more than he had lost in the fire. Hartford told neighbors he should have built this way from the start, that it would have saved him $200 and 6 months of rebuilding work that could have been spent on productive farming. Wilhelm Schmidt completed his own reconstruction in March 1880 and immediately began accepting earth construction contracts, becoming the first professional sod barn contractor in western Kansas. He developed standardized specifications combining German masonry precision with sod building techniques, charging $45 for complete barn construction compared to the $180 and up that timber barns had cost. By May 1880, he carried a waiting list of 7 contracts and had trained 2 apprentices in earth construction methods he had dismissed as primitive just 8 months earlier. Regional documentation began spreading through agricultural journals and government surveys. The Kansas Farmer magazine published a detailed article in March 1881 titled, "The Earth Barn: Fireproof Storage for the Prairie Farmer," featuring Edwards County as a case study in adaptive building techniques. Kansas State Agricultural College sent surveyors in May 1881 to document construction methods and measure performance data. Federal territorial reports noted Edwards County's 0 barn losses during the 1880 and 1881 fire seasons, while surrounding counties using conventional timber construction continued experiencing substantial fire damage. By 1882, sod barn construction had been documented in 34 Kansas counties. Regional variations developed for different soil types and grass species. Technical refinements improved ventilation systems while maintaining fire resistance. Standardized dimensions emerged from Lars's original specifications, adapted for various farm sizes and storage requirements. Earth construction had evolved from one Norwegian immigrant's unconventional choice into accepted regional building practice, backed by measurable performance data. The fire seasons from 1880 through 1882 provided continuous testing that confirmed sod construction's superiority. 3 prairie fires burned through Edwards County in 1880, destroying 4 timber structures while causing 0 sod barn losses. A major fire in 1881 burned 8,000 acres adjacent to the township, with 12 sod barns directly in the fire path. All 12 survived with only minor exterior scorching. 2 timber barns in the same fire zone were completely destroyed. The severe drought year of 1882 brought multiple fires throughout western Kansas, and earth construction demonstrated consistent fire resistance across hundreds of structures. Township records documented an 89% destruction rate for timber barns in fire zones, compared to 0% total losses for sod barns, with only 12% requiring minor repairs to scorched surfaces. Lars's role evolved from struggling farmer to recognized authority on fire-resistant construction. Between 1880 and 1881, he conducted over 40 construction consultations across 6 counties. In 1882, Kansas State Agricultural College invited him to lecture on earth construction principles. By 1883, he had published, with Schmidt's editorial help, Practical Guide to Sod Building, the first technical manual on prairie earth construction. In 1884, he served as consultant for the Territorial Fire Safety Commission. He continued farming but had become the primary expert on construction methods that were transforming agricultural building practices across the Great Plains. Lars's preserved 340 bushels from the 1879 fire provided seed grain for 1880 planting that his neighbors, forced to purchase replacement seed, could not afford. The economic security from avoiding fire losses allowed farm expansion. By 1885, Lars operated 240 acres, double his 1879 holdings. His original barn remained in continuous use, structurally sound after 6 years of service. The 1890 agricultural census documented Edwards County's complete transformation. Of 78 total agricultural storage buildings, 67 used sod or earth construction, representing 86% adoption. Only 11 timber structures remained, mostly built before 1879, or serving specialized purposes requiring conventional framing. Fire losses from 1879 through 1890 showed 0 sod barn destruction compared to 8 timber barn losses. Average construction costs registered $18 for sod barns against $220 for timber equivalents. Township-wide economic savings over 11 years totaled an estimated $12,400, representing prevented fire losses and reduced construction expenses that allowed farm investment in land, equipment, and livestock instead of repeatedly rebuilding destroyed structures. Hartford's 1890 reflection, documented in township history records, captured the transformation's human dimension. I mocked Lars Eriksen for building with dirt, he wrote. Lost my barn, my grain, near lost my farm. Built the second barn his way. That barn stood through 5 fire seasons, 2 blizzards, and a tornado that took 3 timber structures within a mile. Sometimes wisdom looks like foolishness, until fire proves which is which. Schmidt's 1893 professional assessment acknowledged what the fire had taught him. I came from Germany trained in timber frame construction, methods proven over centuries, he said in a documented interview. Took one prairie fire to show me that what works in Europe fails in Kansas. Earth building isn't primitive, it's adapted. Lars understood his environment better than I understood my craft. By 1895, visitors to Edwards County encountered a landscape dominated by earth construction agricultural buildings. Lars's original barn stood 16 years after construction, still in daily use with no structural deterioration. Third-generation sod barns were under construction using refined techniques that had evolved from his initial design. Earth building had become recognized as the superior method for prairie fire zones. Schmidt had trained 6 apprentices in sod construction, creating a generation of builders who had never known timber barn construction as standard practice. September 1895, 16 years after the fire. Lars, now 57, stood with his son beside the original sod barn. The south wall still showed faint scorch marks from 1879. Interior temperature registered cool, despite summer heat outside. Stored wheat remained safe from the elements, just as it had been when fire tested earth against flame and proved which material belonged on the prairie. Lars told his son the story, not of being right, but of trusting knowledge when everyone called it foolishness. 3 neighboring farms stood visible in the distance, all earth construction, all built after the fire, all standing because one Norwegian immigrant had refused to build what didn't work even when the entire community insisted he should. They called it a fool's barn, Lars said quietly. Fire called it the only one worth leaving standing.